What would you do if you were lost and without any hope of being found? This story is about the power of hope. Tara had always felt more alive in the quiet hush of snow-covered trails than anywhere else, ever since her first childhood winter hike where she discovered a sense of tranquil wonder that stayed with her for decades. Raised in a modest cabin near the edge of a vast pine forest, she spent countless nights gazing out the window, entranced by the pristine glow of starlight on white drifts, imagining adventures that would someday call her name. She took her first solo trek at the age of 15, carefully packing a worn rucksack with only the essentials, determined to prove to herself that courage, not just physical strength, would carry her through the icy woods. That successful journey, though short and fraught with missteps, sparked a fire in her spirit, convincing her that she had been guided by a quiet force telling her that nothing was too dark or cold to overcome. As she grew older, she began volunteering for community programs that combined her two greatest passions: nurturing a deep bond with nature and uplifting those in need of a helping hand. One such program was the local Search and Rescue Initiative, a tight-knit group of people who shared her love for the wilderness and her unwavering conviction that no challenge was insurmountable. Many of the team members, much older than Tara, admired her tenacity, her meticulous attention to detail, and an unshakable optimism that infused every briefing with renewed confidence. She quickly became known as the one who never lost hope, even when prospects of finding missing hikers seemed dim, believing wholeheartedly that a little light in the darkness could make all the difference. Her home, nestled at the outskirts of the town, became a sanctuary where she meticulously prepared gear for potential searches, labeling every carabiner and folding every thermal blanket with a precision that spoke of her silent reverence for the lives she might save. Despite the hardships that sometimes came with the volunteer work, from sleep deprivation to the emotional burden of uncertain outcomes, she found herself praying in her own quiet way for guidance and fortitude to continue her calling. Over time, her dedication deepened, and she slowly built a reputation as a reliable point of contact, someone who could keep calm under pressure and navigate the treacherous winter terrain better than most seasoned locals. People whispered stories of how she once rescued a lost dog in a gale, trudging through waist-deep snow for hours until she spotted its bright collar peeking out through a frosted clearing, her tears of relief visible under the beam of her headlamp. That unwavering resolve, interwoven with a sense of empathy for both animals and humans, created a warmth around her presence that felt almost tangible whenever she joined a search party. While some teased that she must have studied every inch of the mountains and forests, she would only smile and say that her heart led her where she needed to go, trusting in intangible guidance to show her the way when the path seemed lost. Such certainty did not spring from mere self-confidence, for Tara had experienced doubt before, those lingering moments of fear that threatened to extinguish her determined spirit when conditions were harsh and time was running out. Yet every time she was on the brink of giving in, something lifted her gaze upward, reminding her that perseverance born of love can light any darkness if one believes, with all they have, in the power of compassion. She often recalled a particular evening from her 20s, when she was caught in a sudden squall, alone and miles from any marked trail, her supplies dwindling, and the bitter wind howling threats into her ears. In that moment, kneeling by a makeshift campfire that sputtered against the onslaught of ice pellets, she felt an inner stirring that told her to press on, guided by the faint glow of moonlight that peeked through ragged clouds. Tara never once claimed to fully understand what steered her out of that perilous predicament, but she never doubted that a quiet faith, built upon a desire to protect and care for others, had ushered her to safety. It was this same quiet faith that underpinned her every decision, from the simple choice to lace up her boots in the morning to the more profound resolve to answer the call whenever someone was lost or in trouble. Her transformations were subtle yet profound, evidenced in how her posture straightened with renewed purpose each time she tied on her gear, or how her eyes sparkled with gratitude whenever she glimpsed the first rays of dawn after a long, grueling night. She meticulously documented her expeditions, not for praise or recognition, but to record every lesson learned, every path taken, ensuring that future searches could benefit from her experiences and perhaps save more lives. When asked why she continued to undertake such dangerous missions, risking frostbite, hypothermia, or worse, her answer was always simple and calm. There was nothing more precious than a life that still had a chance. Over the years, her rescue partner often noted that she never panicked in the face of adversity, even when the howling wind drowned out their voices and snowdrifts rose like walls, because she held fast to an inner anchor that no storm could uproot. Though Tara spoke little about her personal convictions, her eyes would shine with an otherworldly light whenever they succeeded in guiding someone home, as if each rescue reaffirmed the promise that darkness, no matter how vast, was always breakable. She believed wholeheartedly that the wilderness itself, majestic and unforgiving, could be tamed by kindness and unyielding perseverance, as if human compassion was a torch bright enough to melt even the coldest fate. Family gatherings, scarce as they were, consistently ended with her mother pressing an extra scarf or pair of gloves into her hands, quietly remarking that Tara's gentle spirit was needed out there in the frozen hills, where despair lurked like a silent predator. Such reminders, whispered over cups of hot cocoa in a living room that smelled of cedar and pine, fueled her dedication, reinforcing the notion that her greatest strength was not her physical prowess but the intangible warmth she carried within her soul. Whenever she gazed at her reflection in frosty windows, she saw not just a woman with wind-chapped cheeks and calloused hands but a vessel of unwavering hope ready to be poured out for those in dire need. Others recognized this, and it was why the small community felt reassured whenever she was on a mission, for they sensed that her deep reservoir of belief was strong enough to counter even the most chaotic forces of nature. In the quiet times, she would gather old maps, worn notebooks, and battered compasses, carefully planning hypothetical routes through mountain passes, always preparing for the next crisis as though it might arrive any minute. She approached every task with the seriousness of a soldier and the tenderness of a caretaker, double-checking her first aid kit, ensuring extra blankets were always available, and never forgetting to tuck a small keepsake in her pocket for good luck. That keepsake, a simple polished stone engraved with a tiny lantern symbol, had been given to her by a mentor who told her that a heartfelt spark could illuminate miles of darkness, so long as one never lost sight of it. Whenever she felt the cold biting into her bones, she would grip the stone and recall the moment it was pressed into her hand, letting the memory of that quiet ceremony rekindle her determination. Year after year, search after search, Tara's strength and gentleness merged into an unbreakable bond that allowed her to stand firm against the winter's fury, always trusting that a hidden light would guide her footsteps. Even on days when exhaustion weighed her down like lead, a single thought of someone alone and frightened in the swirling snow would spark her back to life, pushing her to lace up and head out. Her father, once worried that her longing for adventure would lead her astray, came to realize that Tara was, in fact, following a path built by compassion, forging a legacy of hope that would touch many lives. As she reflected on her journey, she understood that every moment of her past had shaped her into an instrument of comfort, a vessel that carried a promise of safety into the most desolate corners of the winter woods. This sense of calling, unspoken yet undeniable, was the foundation of her every action, reminding her that true strength often lies in the gentle resolve to stand in the gap when others cannot, offering them a guiding hand and a quiet prayer for deliverance. And so with each passing year, as the seasons turned and the mountains slept beneath endless blankets of snow, Tara remained faithful to her calling, ready to brave any storm, trusting that a steadfast heart could serve as a beacon for lost souls searching for light. On a moonless night that threatened to swallow every trace of the mountainous horizon, Tara found herself pacing her living room, occasionally pausing to press her face against the frosty window as she contemplated the dark sky that stretched endlessly above the snow-laden earth around her. The soft hum of her space heater offered meager comfort against the silent dread that seemed to accumulate whenever the wind howled through the pines, yet she clung to its gentle warmth as a reminder that she and her team would soon be venturing out into far more punishing conditions. She had just finished double-checking a new headlamp and was settling onto the couch with a mug of hot tea when the shrill ring of her phone disrupted the hush, sending her heart racing even before she could answer. Through the receiver, she recognized the voice of the search and rescue dispatcher, an uncharacteristic tremor lacing every word, revealing that something dire had transpired in the unforgiving wilderness that loomed beyond the outskirts of town. The official tone conveyed urgency. A group of campers last seen 2 days prior on a recreational outing had failed to check in or return as planned, and with the weather taking a malevolent turn, there was no time to spare. Tara's pulse quickened as the dispatcher recounted the dire predicament. Newly fallen snow had obscured all prior trails, the temperature had plummeted, and the forecast promised an onslaught of more storms that very night. Gripping the phone tightly, she asked all the necessary clarifying questions, scribbling notes on a worn pad of paper kept by her side just for moments like this, feeling an undercurrent of dread rise in her chest, though she refused to let it seize her resolve. The dispatcher explained that the missing group was believed to be comprised of 4 individuals, none of whom had much winter camping experience, which only increased the magnitude of the situation. Setting down the phone, Tara gathered her breath, placed the notepad on her coffee table, and paused to reflect on the weight of the responsibility that had just been laid at her feet. Although she had answered countless calls for help over the years, each situation carried its own sense of urgency, and this one felt particularly pressing because of how quickly the weather was changing. Within minutes, she had shrugged on her heavy winter parka and begun the familiar ritual of gathering her standard gear: thermal blankets, extra gloves, waterproof matches, energy bars, a medical kit, rope, carabiners, and every piece of equipment that might save a life. She painstakingly inspected each item, ensuring all zippers worked, all flashlights and headlamps had fresh batteries, and every essential supply was sealed against the clammy bite of melting snow. Even in the solitude of her home, she felt the anxious energy of her fellow volunteers, who would be doing much the same thing at that very moment, just as meticulously, while the windows rattled in the relentless gusts sweeping through the valley. As she methodically packed her rucksack, Tara kept replaying the dispatcher's words, picturing 4 stranded campers with dwindling rations, huddled against the cold, uncertain when or if rescue would arrive, possibly losing hope as the hours crawled by. Despite the apprehension churning in her stomach, she took a moment to center herself, touching the small lantern-engraved stone in her pocket and silently reaffirming her belief that light, even unseen, existed for those who chose to keep faith in it. There was an undeniable stirring within her, the same quiet assurance that had guided her on innumerable past missions, reminding her that determination and compassion were as crucial to a rescue as any map or piece of technology. Zipping her bag closed, she swung it over her shoulder and stepped outside into the biting cold, the wind's frigid breath immediately clawing at her face, making it seem as if the storm recognized her arrival and was voicing its protest. The skeletal pines bowed under the relentless gale, a faint whistle emanating from their branches, creating an eerie orchestra that heightened the sense of urgency coursing through her veins. With an unspoken prayer for safekeeping hovering at the edge of her consciousness, she locked her door and trudged to her old but reliable SUV, grateful for the thick snow chains she kept on the tires this time of year. Driving carefully along the icy roads, she wove through the darkened streets of the slumbering town until she reached the search and rescue headquarters, a modest building that housed a few vehicles, some spare equipment, and the unwavering resolve of a dedicated group of volunteers. The parking lot lights flickered in the fierce wind, illuminating a flurry of swirling snow that stung her skin as she stepped out and headed toward the open door, where the faint glow of interior lights beckoned. Inside, the rest of the team was already assembling, their faces etched with worry, though they tried to maintain a calm veneer for one another's sake. The team leader, a longtime mentor and friend, greeted Tara with a firm nod, then quickly gathered everyone around a battered old table strewn with topographic maps, radio equipment, and an impromptu spread of hot coffee and protein bars. They discussed the missing group's last known location, deducing that the campers had likely veered toward an unfamiliar path while trying to escape sudden gusts of wind 2 days prior, placing them in an area with steep inclines and treacherous ravines that quickly become impassable in severe weather. Tara studied the topographical lines with unwavering focus, tracing possible routes with her gloved fingertip, mentally plotting how best to navigate the looming cliffs and dense clusters of trees that could obscure even the brightest beam of light. Seasoned volunteers offered suggestions on how to split into smaller teams, coordinate radio frequencies, and establish rendezvous points, knowing that if the storm worsened, their communication network might be compromised. In one corner, a teammate attempted to patch through a park ranger by radio, hoping for an update on ground conditions, but static dominated the frequency, underscoring the severity of the weather system building in the mountains. Despite the subdued tension in the cramped room, Tara could sense a collective determination taking shape, as though everyone was unconsciously bracing themselves for an arduous yet necessary confrontation with the elements. The team leader noted that the search would likely extend well into the night and possibly beyond, so they needed to ensure each volunteer was outfitted for extended exposure to cold, wind, and near-zero visibility. One by one, they confirmed that everyone's medical supplies were in place and that no one intended to push themselves beyond their known physical limits, a crucial acknowledgement when exhaustion could cost a life. Tara's companion from previous missions, a calm presence who had once seen her battle a gale to save a lost dog, quietly slipped her an extra pair of insulated socks, mouthing a reminder that her endurance would be paramount in the coming hours. Accepting the gift with a grateful nod, she tucked it away, knowing from past experience that small acts of kindness often provided an unexpected reservoir of resilience. More than any plan or piece of gear, it was a united spirit of compassion that bound them together, fueling their willingness to charge into a frigid onslaught that most others would flee from. Once the final checks had been completed, the group huddled in a circle, arms briefly touching in silent solidarity, symbolizing a shared hope that they would find the missing campers in time. The team leader quietly reminded them that conditions would worsen and that splitting up was dangerous, but it was the only option if they hoped to cover enough ground, so they'd pair off and keep in constant radio contact. No one pretended it would be easy, but in each determined glance, Tara recognized the same burning commitment that she herself felt, a steadfast promise that no soul would be left to vanish in the unforgiving snows. Muttering a short wish for fortitude under her breath, she joined her assigned partner, checking both of their radios while also stuffing a few extra rations in their packs in case they needed to create a makeshift camp. The weather reports, grim as they were, predicted a sharp drop in temperature accompanied by more snowfall, increasing the likelihood of sudden drifts and whiteout scenarios that could confuse even the most experienced rescue worker. Despite those dire projections, the team pressed forward, finalizing their routes, marking safe zones on the map, and synchronizing their watches, accepting that they might be trekking for hours or days under punishing conditions. Tara's heart pounded with anticipation, yet she clung to a deep sense of purpose, recalling how often a single glimmer of hope had guided her through similar crises. She could almost picture the missing campers, cold and exhausted, perhaps looking for any sign of rescue, and she vowed silently that she would push herself to the limits to ensure they would not remain lost. The swirling chaos outside, which rattled the windows and cast swirling patterns of snow against the glass, felt like a foe waiting at the edges of their safe haven, daring them to venture out. This unspoken challenge hung in the air, arming Tara's spirit with a resolve that pulsed through every muscle in her body, reminding her that she was no stranger to adversity. With a final glance at the coordinates pinned to the wall, she pulled on her heavy-duty gloves, took a breath, and nodded to her partner, declaring that they were as ready as they could be. As the team filed out into the raging storm, the wind whipped through the parking lot in a whirlwind of icy shards, tearing at coats and faces, nearly muffling any spoken words. Yet beneath the roar of nature's fury, an undertow of unity and compassion gave each step a grounded certainty, as though they were collectively forging an unbreakable chain determined to reclaim the missing from winter's cruel grasp. Tara hoisted her rucksack with both hands and forged onward, taking the lead toward the first waypoint, her mind meticulously running through every detail of the plan while her breath formed wispy clouds that quickly vanished in the night. A fleeting thought of the comforts of her home with its gentle heat and mug of half-finished tea crossed her mind, but she shook it off, holding fast to her faith that warmth was a treasure worth sharing with those in desperate need. Although snow pelted her goggles, forming small drifts on the edges of her hood, she would not be deterred. She had committed to this mission the moment she picked up that call, and nothing short of physical incapacity could drive her back now. She pressed forward, step by careful step, forging an invisible bond with her teammates who branched off in different directions, each determined to succeed against the roaring might of the winter gale. This sense of intertwined destinies, tethered by the common goal of saving 4 unknown campers, bolstered her energy, giving her the strength to press on into the swirling darkness. The night itself appeared to conspire against them, with clouds blotting out any hint of moonlight and the frenzied wind eager to erase the faint footprints they had left behind. Still, Tara felt certain of one thing. No matter how deep the cold bit into her skin or how loudly the storm screamed, her purpose burned brighter than any threat the winter skies could muster. She let that assurance anchor her as she stared into the endless veil of snow, grateful for the small beacon of her team's headlamps flickering in the distance, a scattered promise that no force of nature would break their collective resolve. Night settled over the mountains like a heavy cloak of shadow, swallowing the faint glow of distant headlamps as Tara and her partner trudged onward, bracing themselves against sudden gusts of wind that ripped through the narrow valleys and threatened to knock them off balance. The snow, which had been falling steadily for hours, now whipped into a frenzy of icy shards, stinging any exposed skin and making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, despite the powerful beams of their flashlights. She could feel the weight of the rucksack pressing into her shoulders, each step taking more effort than the last as she sank into the thick drifts, reminding her of the limited time they had before exhaustion and the biting cold sapped their strength. In this punishing environment, the simplest motions became laborious, such as lifting her knee high enough to dislodge her boot from the packed snow or turning her head to catch the muffled calls of her partner, who trudged a few paces behind. The wind's roar devoured the sound of their voices, and more than once she found herself straining to discern whether the noise in her ears was just the howling of the storm or an attempt by her companion to communicate. Darkness pressed in, disorienting her sense of direction, forcing her to rely on the faintly glimmering trail of footprints left behind by the team that had passed through earlier, though these prints were disappearing quickly under the new onslaught of swirling snow. A chill that went beyond the physical gnawed at her, hinting that the storm had grown far worse than any forecast had anticipated, and that if they lingered too long in this open expanse, hypothermia could strike more swiftly than rescue could arrive. She tried to steel herself by clutching the tiny stone in her pocket, a tangible reminder that hope could blossom even in the most desolate places if tended to with enough care and resolve. Suddenly, the shriek of the wind intensified, twisting and surging into a near whiteout that obliterated every recognizable contour of the landscape, leaving Tara and her partner grappling for any sign of the makeshift path they had been following. She reached out to keep contact with her partner's shoulder, desperate not to lose the anchor of another human presence in this sea of swirling chaos, but the relentless storm battered them with such force that their footsteps diverged. Tara felt a surge of alarm seize her chest as the wind thrust her sideways, scrambling her footing and forcing her to stumble several yards away from her companion's last known position. Her outstretched arm missed the shoulder she was aiming for, and she could do nothing but shield her face as ice pelted her goggles, reducing her visibility to a blurred haze of white. She called out to her partner again, but the storm seemed determined to swallow every syllable, hurling her own voice back at her in mocking echoes that offered no clue as to where he might have gone. Disoriented, she fought to regain her balance, heart pounding with a fierce intensity that burned through her veins, reminding her that panic was a luxury she could not afford. Somewhere to her right or perhaps behind her, she thought she heard the faint crackle of static as though someone were trying to reach her over the radio, but the gale drowned the noise before she could confirm its source. The moment stretched into a timeless loop of frenzied wind and impenetrable darkness, every second ticking by like a warning that if she lost her bearings completely, there would be no easy path back. She clutched her radio, pressing the transmit button and speaking her partner's name, but the static that returned felt like an endless void, a grim testament to how thoroughly the storm was overpowering their fragile communication devices. Still refusing to surrender to despair, she adjusted the straps of her rucksack, ensuring that the weight distributed properly, then flipped up the collar of her insulated jacket to shield her neck from the biting wind. Each moment without a response from her team knotted her stomach further, and she found herself thinking of the missing campers, of their fearful faces and how they must be contending with even fewer resources than she had at her disposal. She refused to accept the possibility that anyone, herself included, might be destined to vanish silently into the snow, lost forever in this raging tempest. Though her eyes watered from the sharp sting of the cold, she forced herself to methodically scan her surroundings, faintly recalling a ridge line marked on the map earlier, a place where the wind might be somewhat less ferocious and where she could potentially reorient herself. A sudden gust battered her, almost knocking her off balance, but she managed to stumble toward what she believed was higher ground, each footstep carrying the distinct crunch of unbroken snow that meant no one else had passed this way recently. She recognized that her separation from the group was dangerous beyond words, yet she harnessed the conviction coursing through her soul, the same conviction that had guided every step in her life's mission to protect and rescue. It was a stark reminder that sometimes all one could rely on was the fiery core of hope that burned within, the inner compass that whispered, "Keep going no matter the risk," because turning back without trying to reunite or find the missing was unthinkable. Each ragged breath merged with the wind's cacophony, and she found herself briefly remembering the warmth of her home, imagining the flicker of a solitary lamp upon a windowsill, standing against the dark, a small but potent symbol of what she refused to relinquish. She thought of how many times she had walked into peril, guided by little more than an invisible promise, and how every rescue served as proof that the world often tested the courageous in the harshest ways. Her movements grew slower, each step an act of sheer will, as she fought the swirling drifts and the relentless barrage of tiny sharp flakes that clung to her jacket, her eyelashes, her gear, as if determined to freeze her in place. The radio remained ominously silent except for flickers of static, forcing her to rely on her intuition and the fleeting glimpses she caught when the storm relented for a heartbeat, revealing shapes that could be boulders or simply illusions carved by the snow. Hours seemed to pass, though she could not be certain of time anymore, each minute distorted by the monotony of white swirling chaos and the pounding terror that threatened to overtake her if she allowed it a foothold in her mind. Somewhere in the distance, the faint rumble of thunder drifted across the peaks, magnifying the already surreal atmosphere of the night, suggesting that lightning might soon join the onslaught, a threat that made her stomach tighten with fresh dread. Nonetheless, she kept moving, refusing to let the darkness define her fate, refusing to be overwhelmed by the avalanche of reasons to give up, always carrying that whispered assurance that a light existed beyond the snow's oppressive veil. At one point she stumbled upon a shallow depression between two rocks half buried in snow, and paused to catch her breath, wiping the thin layer of ice from her goggles as she turned in a slow circle to search for any sign of the team. Tara stood at the edge of that rocky outcrop, briefly shielding her face from the relentless onslaught of snow, her shoulders tensing with the weight of both her gear and the responsibility she carried as she clung to the faint glow she had discovered. A fierce gust of wind stung her cheeks and almost extinguished the small beacon, but she steadied herself, reminding her heart that even the smallest light held meaning in the vast darkness. In that moment, despite her separation from the main search team and the diminishing hope of clear communication, she felt a whisper of confidence swirl within her chest, urging her to press on toward the unknown. The blistering cold sent waves of numbness through her limbs, and she clenched her fists repeatedly to keep blood flowing, fully aware that losing circulation in such conditions was a slippery slope toward tragedy. She recalled the faces of those she had rescued in the past, each reflection fueling her determination, silently telling her that no matter how impossible things seemed, she had been called to persevere. The outcrop provided enough shelter from the wind that she was finally able to unfasten her radio, remove her thick gloves, and attempt once more to reach someone on the designated channel, adjusting the antenna in hopes of capturing a stray signal. Static hissed back at her, a stark reminder of the storm's chokehold on her fragile link to the rest of the world, and she felt the first real tremors of anxiety worm their way into her thoughts. With a deep breath, she refocused, slipping the radio back inside her coat to prevent the batteries from draining faster, and cast her gaze toward the swirling landscape that stretched before her like a frozen ocean. She peered through her goggles, searching for any subtle changes in the terrain that might hint at footprints or equipment left behind by either her own team or the missing campers. The faint light that had drawn her to the outcrop flickered again, almost like a heartbeat in the storm, guiding her to take a cautious step onto an icy slope leading downward. Each movement tested her balance, and she used her trekking poles to feel for any hidden crevices, fully cognizant that one misstep could send her sliding into a ravine buried under endless layers of snow. Her breath fogged in the frigid air, forming ephemeral clouds that vanished into the gusts, and she pressed forward with a conviction she had nurtured in countless training drills and real-life rescues. Part of her mind fixated on the missing campers, imagining their vulnerability, their terror at being exposed to such an unrelenting force of nature, and every time the wind whipped viciously around her, she urged her body to hold strong for their sake. She thought about what might be running through their minds, the fear they would be battling, and how essential it was that someone refused to give up until they were found. Gripping the small lantern-engraved stone in her pocket, she allowed a rush of warmth, no matter how intangible, to course through her veins, a tiny spark of hope that flared brighter each time she remembered why she was out here. The swirling snow continued to erode her tracks as soon as they were made, and it felt as though the storm itself was determined to erase every sign that humans once traversed these mountains. Yet she knew that for every furious gust, for every threatening drift, there was an equally potent force in the human spirit, an unyielding commitment to pushing boundaries in the name of compassion. The path downward proved steeper than she expected, and she used every ounce of caution she possessed to keep from tumbling forward, pausing occasionally to check her map, even though the swirling winds made the paper flap like a desperate bird. While most of the landmarks were now hidden under blankets of white, She recalled studying the topographical lines and formed a mental image of how the land curved around the base of a shallow valley. She theorized that if the missing campers had been swept off track, they might have sought lower ground where at least part of the terrain could offer meager shelter from the wind. Though the fierce cold gnawed at her fingertips through her gloves, she made a point of pausing under a gnarled pine whose branches groaned under the weight of accumulated ice, taking a moment to breathe and gather her scattered thoughts. The howling wind reminded her of a wild animal, prowling through the crags, and whenever she tried to focus on finding distinct shapes in the blizzard, her vision blurred with the swirling flurries that seemed determined to confuse her. Still, she forced one foot in front of the other, using the memory of that flickering light as a compass, letting it guide her deeper into the heart of the storm. The descent became more perilous as darkness thickened, and the slope flattened out just enough that she had to be on guard for hidden ice patches, a single slip away from disaster. She glanced at her watch, though it was difficult to keep track of time when hours stretched into one endless struggle against the elements, and realized that dawn was still far off. Despite the gloom, she carried on, unwilling to let exhaustion or disorientation douse the faint ember of belief she held that everything was happening for a reason, and if she continued down this route she might stumble upon clues of the campers' whereabouts. She considered using her flare gun, but with the wind so savage and visibility so low, it was a gamble whether anyone would see it, so she saved that option for a more critical juncture. Through the roar of the gale, a sound like shifting ice reached her ears, and she instinctively crouched, bracing herself against a low boulder, her heart pounding in her chest. After a few moments of holding her breath, she realized it was likely just a tree branch snapping under the weight of the storm, an unsettling reminder of how fragile everything became in these conditions. Tightening the straps of her pack, she continued, forging a slow, deliberate path through the swirling drifts, each step accompanied by the dull ache of protest in her muscles. A half-hour later, or so she guessed from the heaviness settling in her bones, she reached a shallow ravine protected by thick shrubs, where the snow was less fierce, giving her a chance to scan the area for tracks. Her flashlight picked up what might have been faint depressions in the snow, footprints partially filled in by the blizzard, and a flicker of elation sparked in her chest, urging her to investigate. She knelt down, brushing aside the powdery crust, and noted the shape that could only belong to a boot sole, but it was impossible to tell how fresh it was, and every second threatened to obliterate any evidence of who might have passed this way. Regardless, it was all she needed to renew her focus, to remind herself that she was not alone in these mountains, and that the campers must be somewhere ahead. With as much gentleness as she could muster, she stood, wary of how the storm might play a cruel trick by burying the tracks further, and took care to place her own feet alongside them, trying not to destroy this vital clue. She pressed the radio button again, whispering hope into the static, sending out calls that echoed through the hollow channels of the ravine, but no voice returned, and she swallowed her apprehension as best she could. Determined to maintain a methodical approach, she charted the direction of the footprints, stepping cautiously but steadily, mindful that the campers, if indeed these were their tracks, could be injured or running dangerously low on energy. The ravine curved sharply to the left, and with it came a sudden rush of wind that nearly knocked the breath from her lungs, forcing her to brace a hand against the rocky embankment for support. She used the moment to refasten a clasp on her jacket that had worked loose, all too aware that warmth was a precious commodity, and that small details could prove the difference between survival and disaster in the merciless cold. Pushing onward, she felt her chest tighten from the effort, sweat chilling her at every pause, though she told herself that every discomfort was a necessary price in her pursuit of saving lives. Her flashlight beam bounced across the rocky walls, revealing occasional dark patches where ice had melted, trickling water that refroze in odd sculptures, each one resembling something fragile and fleeting. The swirling gusts abated for a brief moment, and in that fragile lull, she thought she heard a distant sound that might have been a shout, faint as a breath, causing her heart to spike as adrenaline flooded her veins. She yelled in response, voice cracking, straining to be heard over the endless hiss of the blizzard, and though no clear reply reached her ears, the possibility that there was someone else out there made her pulse race. Each labored step forward now felt purposeful, as if driven by a gentle current of faith that whispered she was drawing closer, that her presence on this path was no accident, and that the missing would be found. Snow continued to swirl around her ankles, caking the bottom of her pants, but she pressed on, remembering how many times before she had been guided by invisible hands to exactly the spot where she was needed. She paused to shine her flashlight on the ground once again, and to her silent elation she spotted what appeared to be a torn scrap of fabric, partially buried in slush, its bright color a stark contrast to the muted whites and grays. Gently prying it loose, she held it up, feeling an undeniable surge of hope, for the material looked similar to the heavy nylon commonly used in hiking jackets, and it seemed too deliberate a clue to be coincidence. Tucking it carefully into her coat, she let out a visible breath, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, praying that the faint glimmer of progress she sensed would transform into a real-life rescue before the night was through. The temptation to quicken her pace was strong, but she disciplined herself to keep a slow, even rhythm, knowing full well that haste could lead to dangerous mistakes in such an unforgiving environment. The wind kicked up again, but she pressed onward, refusing to let fatigue take root, concentrating on the next step, then the next, each one an act of defiance against the swirling chaos. Time blended into an unending tapestry of snow and darkness, and she clutched the stone in her pocket every now and then, letting it remind her that purpose fueled every stride, guiding her to those who depended on her determination. Her own lips moved in silent pleas for protection, for clarity, and for the missing souls to hold on just a bit longer, believing that every fraction of a second mattered to someone whose life lay in the balance. As she continued descending deeper into the ravine, her radio crackled unexpectedly, and her heart lurched at the possibility of hearing a friendly voice, though all that came through was an unintelligible burst of static. Even so, the faint signal proved that she was not as alone as she felt, that the tenuous threads connecting her to her team and perhaps the campers still existed somewhere in the storm's great fury. Reinvigorated, she clenched her jaw and advanced, unyielding in her pursuit, marveling at how even the fiercest onslaught of the natural world could not quench the fierce glow of human resolve. At last, the ravine opened into a broader basin, its floor ridged with ice formations that glistened under her flashlight, as if beckoning her to explore further for signs of life. She scanned the perimeter and noticed that several trees had been uprooted or snapped in half by the gale, forming a makeshift barrier against the wind, a partial refuge that might attract anyone seeking shelter. Tara emerged from the ravine's narrow passage into a broader clearing where the howling wind abated just enough for her to hear a faint cry for help drifting through the swirling snow, and she immediately quickened her pace, scanning the darkness with renewed urgency. She plunged her trekking pole into the powdery ground to keep from slipping, leaning forward as she followed the desperate sound that seemed to vanish and reappear in tandem with the gusts. Her heart thumped forcefully against her ribs, each beat echoing the conviction that she was on the verge of finding those she had vowed not to abandon, and she pressed on, determined to transform the flicker of hope into a tangible rescue. As she came around a cluster of wind-sculpted pines, her flashlight caught a sudden movement, a figure hunched by a makeshift wall of fallen branches, and the sight of what appeared to be an outstretched arm reaching toward her. She called out, voice hoarse from shouting into the storm, yet the figure seemed too weak or shocked to respond clearly, so she forced her limbs to move faster across the uneven snow. Drawing nearer, she saw that it was a young woman, her face pale with cold and etched with disbelief, as though she could not decide whether Tara's approaching silhouette was real or a fleeting vision conjured by desperation. Tara slid down to her knees beside the huddled camper, gently pressing 2 fingers to the woman's neck to check her pulse, relieved to find it present, if faint, and noticing at once that the girl's jacket was torn. Though the storm's fury still raged, Tara offered a few comforting words, her voice imbued with a gentle strength that she hoped would convey the promise of survival despite the savage conditions. Searching the darkness with her flashlight, Tara discovered 3 more silhouettes sprawled in varying postures of exhaustion, one leaning against a fractured tree trunk, one sprawled on their back with eyes half-lidded, and the last slumped beside a mound of snow. A wave of compassion surged through her as she surveyed the ragtag group, each of them clearly battered by the cold, underdressed for such an unforgiving blizzard, and running out of time to find safety on their own. She called out to them one by one, offering a soft squeeze on a shoulder or a quick word of reassurance to confirm who was conscious, mentally taking stock of their injuries while quietly marveling that they had managed to hold on for so long. The storm's roar made it almost impossible to converse normally, so she raised her voice and told them they were not alone anymore, that the search and rescue team had not given up on them, and that she would get them to safer ground. Despite a tremor of fear pulsing in her veins, Knowing how arduous it would be to lead 4 weakened individuals through these conditions, Tara took solace in the fact that they were indeed still alive, each heartbeat a reminder of why she had pressed on alone. She quickly realized that at least 2 of the campers suffered from severe hypothermia, their trembling limbs and sluggish responses echoing the bleak toll inflicted by the sub-zero temperatures. Another clutched a sprained ankle, grimacing with each attempt to shift position, making it clear that moving swiftly would be a challenge that required all of Tara's ingenuity and fortitude. Reaching into her pack, she retrieved emergency blankets, draping them over the shivering shoulders of the campers as she forced herself to speak calmly, hoping to instill a sense of reassurance amid the chaos. Her mind raced through a litany of first aid procedures she had practiced in calmer settings, reminding herself that panic had no place here, that she needed to exude unwavering resolve so the campers would find it within themselves to cooperate and push through their exhaustion. She helped the young woman who had first caught her eye into a more stable seated position, checking for frostbite on the woman's ears and fingertips, wishing she had more adequate shelter but determined to do what she could with the resources on hand. The camper who appeared most coherent, a man in his 20s, offered a shaky explanation of how they had become lost after veering off their intended route, and how the storm overtook them before they could backtrack, leaving them trapped in the deep snow. Tara listened intently, nodding to show she understood, all the while scanning the trees for a potential spot to create a temporary haven from the freezing wind, fully aware that simply walking out of the blizzard in their current state could be fatal. She asked if they had any gear left, and he held up a battered backpack with a broken zipper, admitting that most of their supplies had either been lost or soaked, rendering them useless in the unforgiving climate. Though her heart sank at the realization that their equipment was minimal, she refused to allow despair to lodge itself in her spirit. Necessity, after all, was the mother of invention, and she had weathered enough crises to know that determination could make miracles from scraps. First, she stabilized the injured ankle with a makeshift splint fashioned from sturdy branches and strips of cloth torn from the camper's pack lining, apologizing for the discomfort but insisting that it was crucial for moving with minimal pain. With each passing minute, the wind gnawed more viciously at their protective layers, so Tara urged them to band together closer to the tree trunk, using their combined body heat while she scouted for a short-term solution. She discovered a partial overhang formed by a rock ledge above a thick drift of snow, and though it was far from ideal, it offered enough of a windbreak to provide them a few precious hours of relative shelter if they could reinforce it. Returning to the group, she gently helped them to their feet, though one camper could barely stand without assistance, prompting Tara to slip her arm beneath the young woman's shoulder and guide her carefully across the short distance. The snow rose nearly waist-high in places, so she cleared a path as best she could by kicking away chunks of ice, mindful that every bit of effort now could save lives. Once under the ledge, she instructed them to sit and lean against the rock face while she commenced building an improvised barrier from fallen branches, using the skill set she had honed through years of rescue training to fashion a rudimentary windbreak that would hold off the worst of the gusts. Each attempt to tie the branches together with rope was a battle against numb fingers, but she soldiered on, ignoring the sting that radiated up her arms, refusing to let a little pain sway her from the task. She draped any spare tarps or ponchos she could scrounge in front of the makeshift barrier, creating a small cocoon that, while basic, was a decided improvement on sitting fully exposed to the storm's wrath. Pushing her own fatigue aside, she then distributed high-energy snacks and sips of water from her thermos, reminding them in a gentle but firm tone to eat and drink slowly, lest they shock their already weakened systems. Though their movements were sluggish and their words often slurred by the cold, the campers seemed to sense that Tara's unwavering focus was their best chance of survival, and they did their best to follow her guidance. She produced chemical hand warmers from her pack and tucked them into their gloves and boots, recalling how seemingly small comforts could make an enormous difference in preventing further hypothermia. In the dim glow of her flashlight, she checked each camper's vital signs as best she could, placing a soft hand on a forehead here, listening for rasping breaths there, quietly encouraging them to hold on just a little longer. Each person's exhaustion was palpable, but her determination stood unyielding, a quiet beacon of stability that cut through the fear swirling in their eyes. As the wind howled mercilessly, rattling the fragile barrier she had built, she tried her radio once more, calling out to her team in a calm but urgent manner, explaining that she had located the missing hikers and needed assistance. This time, the static seemed to waver, allowing a faint reply that was barely intelligible, yet enough of a spark to confirm her voice had reached someone out there, promising that they would try to converge on her coordinates. Relief surged through her, though she refused to let it dampen her vigilance, knowing that the storm's fury could shift again without warning, and that rescue might still be hours away. One of the campers, fighting the pull of unconsciousness, murmured something about the darkness and asked how Tara had found them, her voice trembling with awe at their sudden deliverance. Tara simply smiled gently, pressing a reassuring hand to the camper's shoulder, murmuring that sometimes a spark of light was all one needed to keep going, even in the most dire of storms. She steeled herself for the possibility of a long night, preparing mentally to do whatever she must: share body heat, administer makeshift force solutions, or keep everyone talking, to fend off the life-threatening chill. The storm raged on, flurries dancing in the beam of Tara's flashlight, and she continued to check every inch of their small shelter, plugging gaps with spare clothes or branches, quietly whispering encouragement as she sensed their morale flagging. The hours slid by in a blur of stinging wind, rustling tarps, and shivering bodies pressed close for warmth, yet Tara's watchful eyes never closed for more than a few seconds, ever alert for signs of danger or a faint signal from the team. Occasionally she thought she heard movement beyond the barrier and froze, only to realize it was just the shrieking gusts or a pine tree snapping under the weight of accumulated ice. Still, she refused to abandon her faith that someone would arrive, that her faint radio contact had registered enough for her fellow rescuers to trace her approximate location. Under the subdued glow of her flashlight, she murmured words of encouragement to each camper, sharing the little jokes she recalled from previous missions, urging them to hold on to the fragments of humor that still existed even in adversity. She offered them frequent sips of tepid water mixed with an electrolyte tablet, hoping to stave off dehydration, and she monitored the injured ankle for swelling, applying gentle pressure to check for fractures. Though their progress was slow and measured, she took heart in small signs that they had not yet surrendered to the cold: a camper's quivering arm rubbing another's shoulder, or the faint flicker of gratitude in a bleary gaze. At one point, when a violent gust tore at the makeshift barrier, threatening to rip away a crucial tarp, Tara dove forward, grabbing the edge with both hands, wrestling it back into place, and retying it with rope as she muttered a firm admonition for the storm to do its worst. Dawn broke over the frozen peaks in a muted cascade of silvery light, illuminating the battered makeshift shelter where Tara and the four stranded campers lay huddled, clinging to a fragile but unyielding hope. Against the backdrop of winds that continued to roar and swirl snow like restless spirits, she finally heard the unmistakable crunch of boots against crusted drifts and saw beams of light bobbing in the distance. For a moment, the campers remained unsure whether to believe their eyes, exhaustion and hypothermia weaving illusions that clashed with the reality of rescue, yet Tara's heart soared at the knowledge that her team had come. A burst of renewed energy surged through her limbs, and she rose unsteadily, her breath catching in her throat as she waved her flashlight overhead to guide the approaching figures. The team leader and two other volunteers appeared through the veil of white, bracing themselves against punishing gusts, their determined gazes softening with relief as they spotted the ragged group tucked under the ledge. Shouts of recognition echoed in the icy air, and despite the biting wind, the warmth of relief washed over every face as the rescuers realized that all four missing campers were still alive. One volunteer knelt to check vital signs, gently prying away layers of frost-covered gear while another produced thick sleeping bags and prepared a portable heat source, transforming the area into a field triage station. Tara sank to her knees, partially from relief and partially from the weight of exhaustion, silently offering thanks that their long, harrowing night had not ended in tragedy. The rescue team administered warm fluids and quick medical assessments, supporting the most fragile among the campers with a stoic gentleness that reflected the solemn bond shared by those who willingly battle nature's fury to save human lives. Guided by practiced hands, each camper was secured against the cold with extra blankets, and those who could still walk on their own were helped to stand and lean on rescuers who draped arms around them like living crutches. Tara watched with reverence as her teammates worked in synchronized efficiency, passing bandages, stabilizing limbs, and offering hushed comfort that had the resonance of an unspoken promise. "You are safe now." Though her entire body ached, she refused to rest until every camper was thoroughly checked, repeatedly confirming that no one displayed immediate signs of frostbite beyond the possibility of superficial damage. The sky above was still turbulent, heavy clouds swirling as if reluctant to relinquish their hold on the land, yet rays of a pale sunrise intermittently broke through, highlighting the group's collective resilience. Each time the light fell across the campers' faces, Tara saw the raw miracle of survival flicker in their eyes, and she could not suppress the rush of pride and gratitude swelling in her chest. With considerable effort, the team leader helped Tara to her feet, quietly commending her for having managed a solo rescue in conditions that had scattered even the most seasoned volunteers. She responded with a weary smile, acknowledging that her unwavering faith in a guiding force had propelled her onward when others might have abandoned hope. One of the campers, barely able to speak through chattering teeth, clutched Tara's gloved hand and whispered a broken "thank you," tears tracing frozen trails along his cheeks as he realized just how close they had come to vanishing in the storm. The hush that settled over the clearing was both reverent and somber, each drifting snowflake a reminder of how fine the line between life and loss truly was in these wintry mountains. Keenly aware that time was still critical, the team organized a plan to escort the campers out. 2 would travel with the support of search and rescue volunteers, while Tara and another teammate fashioned a makeshift stretcher for the one whose ankle injury prevented walking. Despite her trembling muscles, Tara secured the stretcher frame, ensuring it would hold fast over the bumpy terrain, determined not to let a sudden jolt or misstep compound the campers' injuries. The trek back through the ravine, though punishing, was guided by the daylight's soft glow and the camaraderie of rescuers who steadfastly coaxed one foot in front of the other, forging a path through drifts that were sometimes as high as their hips. The storm's wrath had eased from a snarling beast to a lingering presence, occasionally buffeting them with vengeful gusts, yet it no longer held the power to strip away their sense of direction or hope. With the help of the team's radios now functioning slightly better in the calmer daylight, word spread to the base station that all 4 campers had been located, and a wave of collective relief rippled through the volunteer network. A couple of hours later, the group finally crested a ridge overlooking the thin, winding road that led back to town, where additional rescue vehicles and medics waited with supplies of hot beverages and warming blankets. The moment Tara saw the convoy, tears she had been holding back streaked down her cheeks, stinging in the cold air, but she welcomed them as an affirmation of the immense relief weighing on everyone's hearts. As the medics loaded the campers into an emergency transport van, checking them for more severe injuries, Tara noticed that each of the rescued individuals clutched the bits of gear she had given them, symbols of a night they would likely never forget. Although the rescue was over, the adrenaline that had fueled Tara's determination began to ebb, leaving her limbs feeling wooden and her mind reeling with the magnitude of what they had endured. One medic, noting her glazed eyes and unsteady stance, urged her to sit down for a quick examination of her own condition, and she obliged with a fatigued nod. Relief coursed through her veins in waves, yet an overwhelming sense of responsibility lingered, compelling her to confirm that every last detail was handled, that the data from her GPS and notes would be recorded to prevent future mishaps. The team leader placed a solid hand on her shoulder, murmuring that she had done enough, that her unwavering resolve and calm leadership had preserved 4 lives against near-impossible odds. Though she tried to speak, her words tangled with emotion, and she merely returned his gesture with a grateful squeeze, deciding that sometimes quiet acceptance spoke louder than any elaboration of thanks. In the swirl of activity around the vehicles, as paramedics hustled the campers away to a local hospital for precautionary treatment, Tara locked eyes with one of the survivors, noticing an unspoken exchange of deep gratitude. She realized that in these moments of rescue, a bond was forged between savior and saved, an unbreakable thread that defied the harshness of the storm and bridged the gap between strangers. Once the medical personnel confirmed the campers were stable enough to be transported, the other volunteers ushered Tara into the warmth of a small command trailer that served as a temporary base. Inside, the furnace hummed, melting the icicles that clung to her jacket, and she felt a new wave of exhaustion settle into her bones as she recounted her experience for the official records. Though her voice wavered, she tried to remain composed, describing the severity of the conditions, the route she had taken, and how she had improvised a shelter at the crucial moment when it appeared all hope might be lost. Whenever her thoughts faltered, the memory of gripping that lantern-engraved stone steadied her, a token of the unseen guidance that had carried her through the darkest hours of the night. In time, she was given the green light to head home, and although her body practically begged for rest, she stepped outside the trailer for a final look at the mountains, now softened by the early morning sun. The storm clouds continued to swirl above the peaks, but they had shifted from an oppressive onslaught to a more subdued state, their whirling forms no longer menacing but poetic, as though reminding her of nature's immense power and the quiet miracles that sometimes arose to meet it. Driving back along the icy roads in a rescue vehicle, she leaned her head against the cold window, reflecting on the journey with a mixture of humility and resolve, whispering silent gratitude for having been able to play her part in saving 4 lives. She thought of the many times she had ventured into those frigid hills with nothing but her unflagging faith in a benevolent force and the synergy of a dedicated team, always believing that a single heart burning with hope could cast enough light to guide the lost. The final mile leading into town was lined with tall pines draped in fresh snow, and she marveled at how the landscape, so recently deadly and unyielding, now stood in stillness, serene and cleansing in the morning air. Pulling into the station, her fellow volunteers helped her out of the vehicle, wrapping her in a flurry of supportive embraces and hushed exclamations of relief that no one had been lost in this perilous mission. Though the small crowd peppered her with questions, she could only respond with a smile that spoke of both weariness and profound fulfillment, her eyes drifting to the snow-dusted horizon where the sun finally banished the last wisps of the storm. Over the following days, the town buzzed with talk of the heroic rescue, of how Tara had braved the worst of winter's wrath alone, guided by a steadfast heart that refused to cede ground to despair. Subtle waves of gratitude passed through the community, manifested in the form of warm meals and well wishes left on her doorstep, though she accepted them with quiet humility, insisting she was just doing what she felt called to do. Even the rescued campers, once they regained their health and warmth, insisted on meeting her personally, showering her with tearful thanks and promising to take the lessons of survival and hope with them wherever they went. Tara, eyes shining, assured them that their own will to live had played the largest part in their deliverance, yet they insisted that her presence had been the sole guide in their darkest moment, a glowing beacon no storm could extinguish. In the stillness of her own home one evening, she penned a lengthy entry in her journal, detailing the events, the moments of doubt, and the intangible sense of guidance that steered her each time she was tempted to concede to the storm. Her mind flitted back to the first day she signed up for the search and rescue volunteer service, never imagining how many lives her quiet conviction would touch and how many mountains of adversity she would summit in the name of compassion. Sometimes she found herself gazing at the little lantern stone by lamplight, pressing it gently in her palm, reflecting on how this journey had reaffirmed her lifelong belief in a light that never really goes out, no matter how deeply winter sinks its claws. In the aftermath, she took time to speak to new volunteers, weaving cautionary tales and words of encouragement into practical lessons about winter survival, in hopes of passing on the same resolute spirit that had guided her. She realized that each mission changed her in subtle ways, sharpening her clarity about what truly mattered: the preciousness of every breath, the importance of offering kindness to those who had lost their way, and the immeasurable power of hope. Spring would eventually come and melt the snowdrifts, yet the memory of this storm would linger in Tara's heart as an unshakable testament to faith in the midst of howling winds and swirling darkness. Watching the sunrise on the morning after her rescue, she felt that intangible but unequivocal sense of purpose blooming anew, confirming that every step she had taken, every risk she had accepted, had been worth enduring. From that point on, whenever the radio crackled and a new mission call came in, she would hold her lantern stone close, gather her gear and step into the cold without hesitation, knowing that a single steadfast heart could illuminate a path for the lost. Although she never boasted, word spread among the townsfolk that Tara was more than just a brave volunteer. She had become a symbol of unwavering resolve, a guiding flame that ensured no storm would claim the people under her watch. Her gentle smile and quiet, earnest gaze spoke volumes about her character, and in the eyes of many she represented the best of what humanity could offer, an embodiment of selfless compassion fueled by the unspoken assurance that goodness could triumph over any winter tempest. Over the course of time, each rescued life she encountered became an addition to the tapestry of her soul, woven together by countless strands of courage, love, and a guiding warmth that knew no boundaries. Whenever she felt the inevitable tug of fatigue, haunted by the memory of blinding snow and bone-chilling winds, the sound of distant wind chimes or a golden slant of afternoon light would remind her that hope endured in every corner of creation. In this way, she never lost sight of the deeper reason behind her call to wander into storms. She was there to be a beacon in the snow, to help others see that even in the wildest nights, some lights can never be extinguished.